Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, or whatever time it is there when y'all are seeing this. My name is Richard Moore. I'm Executive Director of Texas Community College Teachers Association. I know many of y'all already, but in case we haven't met, I hope we get a chance soon to meet in person. I have with me today Beaman Floyd, who does our lobbying work at the Capitol and helps us with our strategy and execution when it comes to policy work at the state level around higher education issues. Before we get started, I just want to thank everybody for their engagement with us this summer. We've had a lot of feedback from members across the state, really, as we've transitioned during the COVID crisis to an online environment. And it has been so good to hear from everybody, to get feedback, to understand what's happening around the state, and to see what's happening on your campus. So thanks for that conversation. It has really been meaningful and has helped us shape our strategy as we've responded to all of this. If you haven't engaged and or looking for new ways to, I would especially point out our Facebook page. That's a great spot for you to be a part of the conversation. Carol Hawkins in our office posts something fresh there every day, and we get a lot of feedback from people really on a daily basis. So that's a good place to check in periodically and just kind of see what the conversation is. If you have thoughts, chime in, and it'll help us keep the conversation going and keep our finger on the pulse so that we'll understand what the issues are, what we need to be focused on. So please understand that your involvement in that discussion really makes a difference. It helps us understand what we need to be focused on. It really helps us do our work and helps position us in a good spot so that when y'all are talking with legislators or people at a state level, we're putting y'all in the strongest position to have an impact there. So thank you for that. And on our calendar, I especially want to point to a couple of things. One is our membership drive is kicking off. It's August and it's that time again. So if you haven't renewed your membership, please go on the tccta.org website. You can see the button there and join or renew your membership in TCCTA. Also, while you're there, I hope you'll look under the events tab on the website. We started last April moving our master teacher seminars from an in-person event every May in Kerrville to an online event where we have small groups of 8 to 10 faculty in small groups, and we're doing these facilitated discussions, master teacher seminars, and it has just been a terrific way for teachers to stay connected with each other, to have a support group. We hear a lot of folks who are participating in this say that it's the one Zoom meeting they actually look forward to every week. So if you're looking for that kind of community, you can find it there, and I hope you'll take advantage of that, because as we get into the fall semester, having that kind of conversation on an ongoing basis, I think is really going to be the need is going to be more felt and more urgent. And so we really want to help everybody stay connected. So have a look for that. And also our Faculty Leaders Conference will be the first weekend in October. You can find information about that on the website as well. That'll be a good way to get up to date on what's happening on kind of key seminal issues affecting community colleges. And I hope you'll make time and get registered for that. We do have, just so you know, a discount. So if you have 5 folks from your college all participating in that conference, then you get a substantial discount on the registration fee. So you might talk with your friends and say, hey, let's go in on this together, just to make sure you can take advantage of that. Otherwise, feel free to reach out to me anytime or more at tccta.org. or to Carol Hawkins in our office, or Katie Agnew, or Oscar Lugo, if you have any questions or need anything from the state office. So with the housekeeping out of the way, Beaman, Floyd, thank you for being with us today. It's good to see your face.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Let's, why don't we begin just with a quick catch up on kind of what's been going on, what's led up to this point, and then we can pivot and talk about, okay, we're about to launch the fall semester. What does that look like? So Why don't we just start with that? Could you maybe give a brief narrative of how the state government, including the governor and the legislature, responded to the COVID crisis, and kind of where that's led us up to today?
Well, sure. Thanks, Richard. And hi, everybody. It's kind of interesting because um, uh, we were already experiencing a pretty strange interim for Texas. And by that, I mean, if you sort of mark the beginning of COVID as that, right around spring break for most of the educational institutions, the interim was already just weird. And it was weird for a couple of reasons. One is that there had been a significant political happening in Texas, and that was the departure of the Speaker of the House, who, to be precise, has not departed. He's still the Speaker of the House, but he, after some pretty intense political issues over the summer and in the fall, the Speaker said that he's not going to run again. He did not file for office, so that is an accomplished thing. Speaker Beaman will not be the Speaker in the coming legislative session. That creates a big power space with people maneuvering for that position. And it creates a lot of uncertainty about who are going to be committee chairmen and what might happen between now and the legislative session. The second thing that we had that was really interesting was there was a huge financial issue related to oil revenue. You may recall that in January, the Russians and the Saudi Arabians went to battle with one another over the price of oil and what they were going to charge in the context of their production, how much they were going to produce into the oil market. And the resulting conflict between those two powers, very large oil producing companies, was that they drove the price of oil down in the world to under $0 a barrel. I won't spend a lot of time on the economics of that, but it's kind of awesome if you want to research it further, exactly what that means. It basically meant that there was so much supply that people were having to pay. Instead of selling oil, they were having to pay to store oil, which created a futures market that was negative rather than positive, which just killed oil production in Texas and the associated revenue related to oil production.
And what's the floor on that, where Texas oil kind of loses its economic position?
The thumbnail is about $50 a barrel. And the reason for that is that Texas oil, as we know, a lot of it comes from fracking and other more high intensity severance concepts. And so when you're trying to get oil out of the ground in Texas, it's not the light sweet crude like comes up in Saudi Arabia. And so if there's if oil is more than $50 a barrel, the intermediate price is more than that, then it becomes profitable to really fire up what's going on in the Texas oil patch, which is where the taxation takes place.
Okay.
And that's the direct taxation on the oil coming out of the ground, what we call the severance tax. Then there are the associated taxes related to payroll and the money people are making in the oil patch, and sales tax for the supplies and materials out there, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So when you go below that, what a lot of producers tend to do is they just shut her down. They say, well, the oil is going to stay where it is. It's not profitable for us to pull it up right now, so we'll wait until the price comes back up. There are obviously costs associated with that shutdown. It's a very difficult decision to make for producers, but it's no choice when you're talking about oil prices in 10, 12, 14 barrels, dollars a barrel. Now the price has recently rebounded up to about 40, but that leaves us in a fairly anemic position in terms of what's going on in oil. All of this was happening in January and February. And just when that oil issue began to resolve itself somewhat and start to rebound, we had what everybody in America sure better know about at this point, which is all of the dislocation and first and foremost public health crisis, and then secondarily the economic crisis associated with COVID-19. Here's an interesting thing, I think, in my space, in the legislative space, in terms of dealing with COVID-19. It hit us just on the calendar at, in some ways, I don't know how to say, I need to figure out a sensitive way to say this, and the best time it could have hit us. Because it hit us where the end of the semesters in both public education and higher education were endable, right? Most schools said, we've got spring break coming up, we're gonna try to make it to spring break. Some did, some didn't, but then we're gonna take the week off after spring break, and then when it became apparent this was really a crisis that was not under control, most of the colleges and public schools in Texas said, okay, that's it. We're just not going to do the rest of the semester. It also hit us really in the deep part of the legislative interim. We were not in session this year. And so the interim had already been going slow because of the election cycle and because of the issues aforementioned with the speaker and that kind of thing. And so when we got hit with COVID, we just sort of said, well, let's just keep going slow, which is what we've been doing. And so from the middle of March to now, here in the first part of August, we have basically been able to mark time on these two really big public policy issues in Texas. That is the operation of education in Texas and the operation of the legislature in Texas. Mm-hmm. But here we are. And
but now, I think that's kind of that's what I'm interested in, is how did we use that time? So we were in a position where where we did have a runway that we could put some things in place, make some decisions, plan, find out more about find out how that was going to, things were going to play out. How did the legislature and how did the governor use their time?
Well, I mean, this is my opinion, spotty, I guess would be the best way to describe it. I mean, we understood that there was going to be a significant dislocation, but what we didn't know was how bad that dislocation was going to be, right? I mean, we've all been searching for data.
Well, I think we did know how bad it, I mean, the data was there. The data was there.
Sure. Yeah. And that's why I say spotty. Because I think that I think it's well worn that we have a public crisis, we have a public health crisis. It intersects with an economic crisis that intersects with a policy and the normal operations of the state policy crisis that is all under the overarching umbrella of the politics associated with COVID. Mm-hmm. And so there is a critical election coming up in 2020, and the sum of all of those parts become the text of what people are thinking about when they go to the polls. And so, Richard, I mean, I'm trying to be very precise when I say this, but I think what you're saying is spot on, that we did not use our time as wisely as we could have because we had very spotty leadership, and we were hoping that the crisis wouldn't be as bad as it has been. And this is my opinion. At the end of the day, we did not use our time nearly so wisely as we could have to get ready for what's coming at us in the fall. And when I say we, I mean the general structure. Lots of individuals have used their time very wisely, and lots of entities, organizations, institutions have done so. I'm talking about in the context of the overarching, we're all moving in the same direction with the same set of expectations.
Well, let me ask you this, because I've found this to be a recurring theme in all of this, and I've seen a lot of people talk about it. As you're saying, there's an economic crisis and there's a public health crisis, and many people, not everybody, but many people pit those against each other and say, well, which ones should we address? Should we just open up because the economy needs it, or should we protect public health? And it's always seemed to me that if all you care about is the economy, the way to best protect the economy is to take care of the public health crisis. That the economy is never going to be okay until that's addressed. And so they're not at odds with each other, that you have to solve one to solve the other. Right. How does that line up with the governor's thinking and other folks in Austin? Is that a widely held view, or do they really think that you can just focus on the economy and not the public health crisis?
Well, I think the answer to that is sort of publicly apparent. What you saw was a desire to get the economy open at the end of May. You saw a loosening of restrictions on a timetable. You saw a result. And I would highly recommend to those of you who don't go there every day, there's a website called Worldometer that does a pretty good job of tracking through time large things. It tracks Texas at the county level. It's a huge worldwide data gathering organization that actually tracks Texas by county if you through a couple of clicks. And you can just see it. It's as clearly illustrated as it can be in terms of the daily cases, in terms of the number of active cases, in terms of coronavirus deaths. There are substantial bar charts, and what they show is that we pushed to reopen on a timeline. The virus said no. Mm-hmm. We got a result from that, at which point we reached a decision point in mid to late June of that would answer the question that you were asking, which is, are these things actually a zero-sum game with one another, or what are we doing and how do we do it? I think that what you have seen is a partial, not total, but a partial turn by some of the leadership here in Texas, including the governor, to say, no, we do have to take care of the public health crisis better. And the governor has charted what I would describe as a middle course. He's been trying to find a space in the tension between people who are really want to open for that economic interest and the public health data that he's receiving, and he's just getting blasted from both sides. Mm-hmm. That does not, by the way, necessarily mean you're doing the best job you can do. There's a fallacy, I guess, in public affairs, which is if everybody's mad at you, you must be doing a good job. Everybody can be mad at you because you're not doing a good job. But I will say that I think that I will say, in terms of an observation of the executive branch, that they exhibited some flexibility when in that second push of the virus. The result of that is what you're seeing now, which is more authority given back to the local authorities related to public health ordinances in local places. A little bit more of a sense of we're going to have to actually deal with this as a constructively talking to each other about it, instead of just orders coming from the larger branch of government going to the smaller branch of government. The problem is that what we don't have is we don't have a very clear we certainly don't have a set of data measures saying when we get to this point, that's when we can do this thing. Mm-hmm. Some would argue that those just aren't available in this unprecedented thing. Some would argue that nobody wants to create that definition because it means that you might want to open and you can't, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so the bottom line is that we continue to, in my opinion, collectively stumble imperfectly through this thing without some clear guidance. And I do want to say one more thing, and that is that I think that you can characterize the first 3 to 4 months of this thing as a public health crisis, absolutely first and foremost, a human crisis, really. Mm-hmm. And then as an attendant economic crisis, but we're moving into a really important third phase of this thing, which is a policy crisis. this is a thing that I'm very interested in for our institutions and our instructors and all our folks out there. And I'm not talking about a policy crisis in terms of the catastrophe policy or the disaster policy related to COVID. I'm talking about a policy crisis in that we have calendars, and those calendars have things that you have to do. You have to have constitutionally, we have to have a legislative session that starts the second Tuesday of January. Mm-hmm. Constitutionally, we have to have elections. And then by federal law, we have to have elections on certain days. This has been a celebrated issue recently in the press, I think. We have laws that talk about the kind of reporting we have to do and what our responsibilities are to the state related to our institutions, going to school and having contact hours and doing lots of things, right? And we are now where we were able to basically mark time from March into the naturally slower space of the summer. We're really accelerating toward a place where all of a sudden there are lots of policy concepts that need to be satisfied that we're not going to be able to satisfy.
Just logistically, yeah. So talk briefly about what this looks like. You talked about kind of the delegating of authority and decision making. At the state level, are you seeing decisions that affect our colleges coming out of the governor's office, or are they coming out of the Higher Education Coordinating Board? Is there conversation between the governor and the commissioner?
I think there's clearly a lot of communication in the executive branch of government. That you've got basically a cabinet for the governor of these agency heads, and Harrison Keller, Dr. Keller of the Higher Ed Coordinating Board is one of those people. Mm-hmm. And so there is definitely a sense of mission in the executive branch of government about trying to be methodical and trying to, and again, I say this, I say this in the sense of a fairly dispassionate observation of people trying to work through a catastrophe, mm-hmm. What's happening. They're talking to each other and they just don't want to step on each other or run into each other going both ways. They want to be coordinated in the sense that they don't want to be giving contradictory advice and making contradictory pronouncements in a way that we've seen, frankly, in the federal government, where you've seen contradictory advice being given, contradictory announcements being made. In that regard, the executive branch in Texas has done a pretty good job of being internally coordinated. With regard to what that means for us and our institutions, it means that what we've gotten is guidance in these little pieces. If you go and look, for instance, at the Higher Ed Coordinating Board website, you'll see they have an FAQ section related to COVID. And that's sort of where you're seeing the big guidance. If you're looking for a large document guidance, it's like from May 20th, which is a long way back in this thing. If you're looking for what's going on today, August 6th, there are 4 or 5 new pieces of guidance that have been issued today under that FAQ section. And you can see that they're coming out every other week or so as tensions are being identified. What you're not seeing is, okay, we're not going to do this for the fall semester, right? Or we're not going to, we're going to really set some metrics for what constitutes going to school and what doesn't. We still have, and I'm sure that everybody who's watching this, unless something really changes between the date of this production and y'all looking at it, there's still just not a clear sense of it's October 2nd. What am I going to be doing?
Well, I spoke with the commissioner at our Leading from the Middle conference a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about some of these questions about opening up and how that's being done, and he was pretty clear that, I mean, he's been talking a lot with presidents and chancellors around the state, and he's observing what colleges are doing, but he's much more watching what schools are doing than directing, here's how it's going to be done. Right. So I find that a certain uniformity seems to have emerged, or a very rough uniformity about moving most classes online with a subset of hybrid mixed in person and online,
Right.
just to reduce the number of students in a classroom at any given time, and then a much smaller number on campus for on-campus classes, and those are the ones that they just can't do. They can't deliver the instruction any other way.
Right.
So that I think just the necessity of the situation has created some uniformity, but even within that, there's differences. But it's emerged out of the campus level instead of out of the from the state level.
Yeah, the concerned public affairs consultant in me says, on the one hand, that's good, right? I mean, you're getting the wisdom of the community appears to be emerging, right? As far as guidance is concerned. What concerns me is not having a definitive statement that we are going to follow the wisdom of the community. In other words, what we know, what we have is we have a demonstration. You guys, it reminds me of one of the worst jobs I ever had, where I asked my manager what I was supposed to be doing because I really didn't know, and he said, "You just go, and I'll tell you when you hit a fence." And I was like, "What does that mean?" Right? And it creates quite a tension because of course I galloped off like an idiot right over the side of a cliff. But the fact is that part of what would be helpful would be a general public agreement saying, you all are not going to be held to the standards of our normal standards of the normal checks in the box that you have to make. I hesitate to say accountability because I've always believed that our internal accountability is much stronger than anything the state is imposing on us. Mm-hmm. But what the state does have is it has like management tools, and we are held responsible to certain management tools. And there are some things we're simply not going to be able to do as this thing goes forward in COVID. And I would love for there to be some sort of definitive statement that says that's
we have a special dispensation because of this.
You really have flexibility. What we're being told is, well, we're going to be flexible. And then my question back is, and continues to be on a daily and weekly basis with the executive branch of government. Okay, what does that mean? Mm-hmm. What is it? It can't be a question of individual fiat, or you don't want something that happens where somebody says the wrong thing or somebody gets upset or there's just a general misunderstanding about what that means, and all of a sudden somebody's failing something that they're statutorily required to do. We would like, and will continue to seek, much greater clarity.
And that's something I think we find also with SACs. There's a similar tension there, and I think to a fair extent, it's completely understandable. If you or I were in the position working for the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools, or if you or I were the governor of Texas, we don't know the answer to some of these questions. Right. I heard from many members, especially earlier this summer, saying, I don't know what's going to happen in the fall. Should I be preparing online syllabi or face-to-face? And I'm not getting clear guidance on this. In early June, it wasn't like someone knew and wasn't telling us. It's that nobody knew. And so some of it's just the nature of the crisis that we're in. But we do need to be aware that when that's happening, that there is a price for not knowing. Yeah. That it creates an accountability issues and expectation issues. And it also means that people can't do what they need to do, because if you're that faculty member, it's perfectly reasonable why the college isn't giving more guidance, because they don't know yet, but the need for that guidance is just as real. And so it's a bona fide crisis on both sides.
Well, I think the boundary, Richard, I mean, there are going to be things that we don't know. And part of my work here now in Austin on a variety of fronts is being able to say with confidence, some things are a mystery. We're learning that our our desire to be in control of ourselves in our society and of all the things, all the external things that happen is just a fool's errand, right? That there are things that are going to happen that we need to be ready to constructively work through together when nobody really knows what the outcome is going to be. But what's the boundary is when you have aspirational, and again, I certainly won't labor the point because I think we're all watching the news and seeing this. What we really need to avoid and what we need to continually press into is don't create a false expectation that shapes an effort in a direction or requires an effort in a direction that ultimately is just not going to happen, right? Because that's just wasted effort. And that's a real problem, particularly when we are getting ready to be as short as we're going to be in resources, and as strained as we're going to be in putting together these programs out of nothing.
Well, and especially when there are real consequences to hitting a fence, like your former boss said. That I'm thinking about K-12 in particular, and they have a very different circumstance than community colleges, but opening up high schools or elementary schools entirely is going to create an enormous health risk that it's not like some artificial consequence that, okay, we'll course correct. It's that people start getting sick and taking a virus home with them, and waiting for that sort of mortality to start happening to course correct means that the damage is done. So I think part of that, the timing of our decision making is going to be crucial in all of this.
Sure. And on an even more fundamental level, I would say, and I would say this to all of our faculty, that I think we should love each other and support each other and be courageous together. I think we have all of those values of being good, resilient. We talk about resilience a lot. I think it starts with our faculty, frankly. That one of the things I love about TCCTA is that you live in a space where you're dealing with lots of resilient people fostering resiliency for their students, and that's I love that. But you don't want to waste that commodity with gratuitous stress and with gratuitous uncertainty and with a gratuitous lack of employment of resources and planning. That we need to be as resilient as we have to be, but that shouldn't be required of us. It sort of reminds me a little bit of the macro issue we have with rigor, right? Which is where we say our people are serious about their jobs and they want to be rigorous, but don't just make them be the sole guardians of rigor all the time. That's not cool. And in the same way, I would say all of the systems of government should be able to rely on our resilience, but they shouldn't waste it. They shouldn't gratuitously use it. And so I guess what I would say to our audience now in this complicated and far-ranging and very accurate statement of, yeah, we don't know what's happening yet. Be resilient and be courageous and be all those things you are, but also be advised that we're working and we think everybody should be working not to squander that resource unnecessarily.
And from what you're seeing now, what would you advise a faculty member going into this fall semester? Let's kind of stipulate a faculty member who's teaching all online classes, or let's say mostly online with maybe one hybrid class. How do they plan going into the semester?
Well, I would say, and again, I tread lightly here because there are people in institutions and involved in structures that are far ahead of, I'm looking at the big survey around the state, and not in that specific space that they are. I would say that if you are involved in mostly online or all online courses, you're kind of ahead of the game, because although things will be changed for you and be different for you, and certainly your loads might shift in one way or another. I am very concerned about people who have a strong in-person component to their teaching, basically having to plan and then have an equally well thought out contingency plan. That's a lot of work, and may be impossible for some things related to lab work. And I mean, we all know what they are. A lot of our CTE instruction is in that space. A lot of the lab work is in that space. And people who are responsible in a management way for the health of our campuses, and from the, for how do we really, if we're going to offer in-person options to students, what does that really look like, and who wins the lottery? If there's a high demand for it, how do we actually manage that? Do we have a lottery letting some people on the campus and others not, or however you would do it? Conversely, if you go to all the effort of creating this in-person space and nobody cares to show up because the numbers are still frightening, what is that?
Yeah. Well,
and then the third, if you do it and people show up, but then everything takes a turn because the numbers change, right?
Well, and that's what, and in my conversations with people on campus, the big contingency they're bracing for is whatever percentage of students are on campus. When or if there's a case on campus, then everybody in the affected area is going to be quarantined for 2 weeks. So guess what? Your courses just went online, at least for the next 2 weeks. So it's,
And so I guess my question or my challenge back to the spaces that have this expectation of getting people on campus, and it's a little bit different for higher ed than it is for public ed. We have a lot more, obviously a lot more experience with large scale online instruction. And we don't have the same kind of imperative that is, most of our students are, obviously with the great exception of dual credit, we don't have a lot of students who are minors who are a childcare issue for people who otherwise would like to go to their jobs or need to go to their jobs. And so we do have a lot of the point of contact issues related to social services at our community colleges that they have, that public ed has. And so it's complicated, like our society, it's really complicated. But what I would say is that it seems like the real contingency is, can you do it all online? And if you sort of looking at your situation and say, if you have a choice about being able to basically stockpile some resources in terms of, if you're not doing a lot of online, talking with your peers who do it and learning how to do it, making sure that you have the fundamental technical support and the pedagogical support to do it, I'd do it. Because as far as I know, there's no secret body of knowledge somewhere that says, no, everything's going to be fine for the fall semester. It's kind of like, who was it? Was it Vince Lombardi, who used to, or I can't remember which, George Hallis, I think, used to talk about the forward pass, and he said 3 things can happen and 2 of them are bad. In football, well, that's kind of what's here. Only one thing can happen for in-person instruction that's going to work, and that is that COVID really recedes and it doesn't come back, and everybody comes to school and we have college like we usually do. There are a bunch of things that can happen that will push us back into a space, I think, of online communication. So we need to think that way.
Yeah, and it does seem like of all the factors in all this, communication is probably going to be the most important, because we'll be most likely in a very fluid environment, especially at the beginning of the semester, as unexpected things happen, and we've got to adjust. And so the more clarity we can have, even at, especially at the campus level, where everybody understands, okay, this happened, and so everybody in this building needs to do the following things, that can help minimize the disruption.
Yeah. I mean, I think that I think that one of the things that is emerging that you pointed out a little bit earlier, and that I'm seeing at a lot of different levels in the state, is, notwithstanding all of the outside pressures on this issue. It's really the wisdom of the community that is asserting, that is beginning to assert itself. And I mean, I say that with care because I know that there are frustrations with that sometimes, and frustrations with how decisions are made at the smallest, shoot, in my house. But they're mostly my wife being frustrated with me accurately, but the fact is that I think we are seeing the real surface because it must. And I would love to be more efficient, but I am gratified to see that reality seems to be asserting itself somewhat. The question is, it's a hard thing for me to say to the people watching this video or anybody else, hey, you all are individually responsible for an individual contingency plan, whether or not you have good leadership at various levels or not, because that's just not fair, but it's also good advice, you know. And so it's and so keep talking with each other, keep garnering support from your communities, keep talking to us, please, as we try to figure out the big interconnected picture of this thing.
Let me ask you a couple of specific questions. I know that there was a great deal of discussion about the impact that this is having on international students, their ability to stay in this country if they were not taking, if they're not enrolled in face-to-face classes. What can you tell us about that, you know, at the federal level, or how the governor or the commissioner is responding at the state level to issues involving international students?
Yeah, it falls into the sort of same category of some uncertainty, but what you had was you had the initial pronouncement, and this was from the federal level, this was from the White House, that said that those students who were not in, the students who were in school but were not going to be in face-to-face courses would have their student visas revoked. And there was an immediate, very strong pushback, bipartisan pushback, against that pronouncement. And there has been a recession of that that statement, and threats from Congress to do things about it, and in general sort of a pushback. It remains, I think, I see it as remaining in a state of uncertainty because those things ebb and flow. I mean, with regard to Texas, I did not see any sense of joining in that. Quite the opposite. That we said, look, we're going to try to make this as rational as possible, and that's not a rational proposition.
And those students are important to us. So
very much.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that was, again, I think that you had that, and again, I don't say this politically, I say it just intellectually, for me, inexplicable statement that came out of in the middle of this thing that came out of the White House that has then been sort of knocked around and knocked back in the real spaces of where we're doing stuff. Okay.
What about federal funding? I know everybody's just kind of waiting with bated breath right now. Are you hearing anything? And what, from your perspective, would you say is at stake for Texas in this next go around of funding?
Well, I mean, a lot. First of all, just as a quick reminder, in the CARES Act, the preliminary CARES Act that got passed, Texas got $12 billion. Which is really making our budget, our current year budget work right now. We still think we're going to be about $4.5 billion short on the current budget cycle as we roll around toward the legislative session. I would also just remind people that we will complete our first year of our 2-year budget this coming September 1st. So we're actually not even halfway through the current budget. That being said, we know that it's going to be an absolute disaster in terms of revenue collection, or it's very likely to be that in any case. And the comptroller, this just a few weeks ago, came out and said in no uncertain terms, he's predicting a $4.5 billion shortfall by a year and a few days from now. So there's that. The reason that it's that small is because the federal government gave us $12 billion some of that going directly to our institutions, some of it going directly to cities and counties, some of it, the balance, about $8 billion going to the state. There is a second tranche of money that would be a big, a relief act. We all know that it's, as of the time of production here, hung up in Congress. Everybody wants to do it, but signs are getting worse that there's some just fundamental structural disagreements about how that money will be spent and who's going to get the money. It's important to Texas because at the end of the day, if you look at any of this money, it almost always is within a few percentage points of the population base of a state. In other words, that your proportionate share of the numbers that you hear at the federal level is proportionate to your share of the population of the United States of America. And we run just under 10% of the population of the United States. You know, we're coming up on 30 million people here, and the United States has just over 300 million people. Now, a little bit more than over 300 million people living here. But when you sort of count in the different weights for things that we're doing down here, being a border state and the economics of our state, that kind of thing, we typically wind up with about 10% of any big federal thing that's going to everybody. And so if you're talking about $1 trillion, that's a lot of money. And, you know, and if you're, and I'm talking about $1 trillion over time for the entire tranche.
Has the governor expressed any preference or specific need as to what form that funding should take? Because no. I mean, is he saying just give it to the state and we'll administer it? Is it?
That's certainly what they would prefer, just in terms of, because that's how governments work.
Right.
Yeah. Give it all to my office and I will distribute it beautifully, right? Yeah, I mean, sure. I think the executive branch would like that money passing through the executive branch of government by and large, and say we will distribute on an as-needed basis. It's kind of interesting because there have been some emerging, not from Congress, but again from the executive branch nationally. There are issues related to the funding of the National Guard, for instance, just this week, that some states are going to get continued funding at 100% for the activities of their National Guard, some are not. And Florida and Texas are going to be funded 100% for the continuing operations of their National Guard, at least as of this morning.
Right.
And so,
but for our institutions, I mean, do you see funding flowing straight to our institutions, or do you see it being?
I think both.
Interim staff.
Yeah. I think both by the time Congress is finished with it. I think that, I mean, and this is just my feelings on it, and then looking at the development of the federal legislation and who's negotiating it. But I think it ought to be similar to what we saw in that first CARES Act distribution, which is a proportional distribution to the state to be used with some discretion, and then to individual institutions for individual policy things like higher education and the things that we're doing. So I would imagine that once again you'll see something that is sort of a formalized proportional distribution, if they can ever get a bill done. My biggest concern is not the mechanics of that internal distribution, because I think that'll be sort of what it is. My greater concern is sort of the bigger meta train wreck. The closer that we get to the national election in November, if what I don't want to see is us get so close to that election without a deal that people start thinking it's more politically expedient to delay a deal. That you say, well, we can survive for 8 weeks or 10 weeks or 12 weeks. And the question is, when do you reach that boundary where the political calculus gets to be, it's better for us not to do this thing than to get it done. Mm-hmm. To the extent that they seem to be at loggerheads, again, as of the date of this recording, this could all change between now and when you guys are watching this. But right now there's a lot of pressure to get something done, but there's beginning to be that idea of, why don't we just wait? Because nobody wants to give up this close to an election.
Okay.
and everybody wants to blame the other guy for not doing it this close to an election. And we're seeing that the beginning of that playing out in a broad scope right now. And
so if you teach, or if you're an administrator at a community college here in August of 2020, we've got a fall semester that we're right on the verge of. We have elections coming up. We have a legislative session coming up in January. What should you be doing right now? What's the most effective use of your time right now to help shape the policy environment we're in?
Well, I think, and I said it a little bit earlier, this is gonna sound a little Pollyanna, but that's me, I guess, which is love and support each other first. I mean, this is a community. This is really a community effort, and I always believe this about public affairs. It's not the United States is not designed to be a dictatorship. It's designed to be a wisdom of the community pushes upward through the governmental structure, not the other way around. And I think that you're seeing that design in action right now in Texas and at our institutions. And it really starts with the people that we're dealing with. It's kind of what we always say: the best thing that you do for yourselves at the Capitol is how well you do your job at your institution, because that becomes the text of the conversation. And I have great faith in that from our membership and from our institutions. But the second thing you need to do is communicate that job that you're doing. And there are really two ways you can do that. One is through groups, associated groups. We're one of those groups, the best one. But that talk to us and read our stuff and find out what everybody else is doing and continue a broader communication with one another, so that when we see emerging patterns, we can talk to policymakers about those. And when we hear something that's important, relevant from policymakers, we can distribute that to you, right? We're a communication tool in that regard. And the second way is direct communication with your elected officials. If you feel comfortable talking directly to an elected official, understanding that they're under an enormous amount of pressure and operating in a great state of uncertainty right now, drop them a line and say, this is the perfect time of year to say, FYI, I know you're worried with a lot of stuff and how it's going to happen. Here's what we're doing, right? Here's what I'm doing in my classroom, and here's what I perceive my institution is doing, and just wanted to, somebody might ask you, and we wanted you to know, right? There is nothing like going to a legislator and saying, here's a little value added, here's a little intelligence from your own district. So that, because they have big, complicated districts with a lot of stuff going on. So if you can find a way to communicate with your legislator and just say, we're moving on, we're doing. If there is a case where you say, we could use a little help, then sure. But to the extent that all you're going and saying, you don't have to have an ask to go and talk to these people. Mm-hmm. You just have to have a story that's relevant to you and to their district. And every one of you has that right now. You're all working in a public policy space where you're trying to make something happen in the midst of a catastrophe. And you're doing so with talent and resilience and the wisdom of the community, to the extent that you can say to a legislator, here's basically what's going on. Just wanted to let you know. And if you have any more questions, here's my number. Feel free to call me. That's really valuable right now, I think.
Yeah, that's something I've been thinking about, actually. I mean, you and I talk about this all the time, but I think, in March, when we were kind of seeing this exploding all around us, thinking about what are the things we're going to look back on when the legislature meets and wish we had done. And fortunately, it was March at the time, and it's August now, that we can do those things. And so what is the story we want to be able to tell in January about how community colleges responded to this crisis, and then go do those things. So you'll have that story to tell. And I mean, we are just so pivotally positioned, right there in a difference-making position on so many levels. 85% of the nurses in Texas come out of community colleges. There has been a nursing shortage for some time, and healthcare workers are under all kinds of duress right now. A lot of PPEs and medical supplies were provided by community colleges when all this broke out. And so we stepped up and said, we need to help our community. When it comes to training people for jobs, with unemployment soaring right now, getting people skilled up and ready to get back into the workforce, if it doesn't happen at community colleges, it isn't going to happen at any kind of scale. And so we're in this great position to make a difference. And for me, if you had a choice between sitting around waiting for the coronavirus to be over with nothing you can do until it ends, or being in a position where you can be involved in solving a problem, I'd rather be involved in solving a problem. And I feel like our people are really blessed with an opportunity. It may not feel like that sometimes because it's a very difficult task, but we're in a position where we can really change the outcome for Texas. And to be able to do that gives our work a lot of meaning. And it also gives us a very powerful narrative come January to say, when McAllen or Houston or El Paso or Denton needed us, we stepped up.
Well, which will mean in a period of really sharply diminished resources, we're a good bet. Mm-hmm. And I think as all y'all can tell from the last hour of this conversation, I try to be really careful to be precise and measured. Not make assumptions about what other people are thinking or make assumptions about other realities when I'm in a conversation like this. And I stand by that commitment for sure. I can say without reservation that I believe very strongly that you are doing more and better and working more resiliently and smartly and courageously than people know, right? What you're doing more than people know you're doing. It's not like people think you're doing more than you're doing. And I would love to close that gap because I think that's an important part of this story, that you all are really working on this stuff is really important. And going forward and solving problems and just lapping a lot of the world in terms of dealing with this crisis. It's not a contest, but if it was, we'd be winning. And that's I think that's important. Again, it makes me proud of the association with you, but it also, I think, is an important part of the story that we need to make sure that we understand to be able to tell it in the spaces where we tell stories, and that you go forth and tell. Because it's as Richard is saying, it's this is an important time for people to really know what's going on, and what did you do in the COVID is going to be a relevant question this time next year, and we need to be able, this time 9 months from now, we need to be able to answer that question.
Well, and just one opportunity that people have to tell that story is on our Facebook page. So I really do want to reiterate what I said at the top of all this. Please visit our website, the blog, where you can get a lot of good information. There's a comment section there, and the Facebook page, and tell the story. I think it would be great if you just said, here's a thing that we're doing at our college or in my department that is really meeting a need in our community right now. Yeah. And I think the more we can pull those stories together, the more effective we can be. TCCTA has always been a genuine grassroots organization, that this isn't, the advocating for community colleges and community college faculty is not something that Beaman just walks into the building and starts talking to people. It comes from the community, and Beaman is in a good position to help that resonate and amplify and make sure that the message gets to the right person. but it really comes from our members. And that kind of message and that kind of messenger is extremely powerful and responded to in the Capitol by elected officials and by their staffs. So please take us up on this and engage. It doesn't take a lot to do, and it can make a real difference. Beaman, I want to thank you for your time today and for all the work that you do with us and for us. It really makes a difference.
Thank you, and I always appreciate the opportunity to talk with our members out there.
Fantastic. Everybody take care, be careful. Take care of yourselves, your families, your students. Let's all stay connected and continue this conversation, and have a great semester. Thank you.